Hi guys, it's Eric Cressey, and today we're going to talk about what happens on the trail leg during the pitching delivery. What we know is that being able to pitch requires a ton of hip extension. So if you're a right-handed pitcher, effectively you're sacrificing the passive restraints in the front of your hip in order to get extra hip extension. Most people don't have the crazy amount of hip extension it takes to get down the mound. So really one of two things happens when folks go to a compensatory pattern if they lack that true range of motion. Is first, they may just extend through their lumbar spine. So these are your guys who have the classic low back tightness the day after they pitch, or they actually experience it during their actual outing. At the other end of the spectrum, you actually have individuals who will wind up with hip pain in the front where all that hip extension is taking place, and what's happening is the head of the femur is actually gliding forward and irritating the capsule or other structures in the front of the hip. So one of the things that we look for when we screen our pitching athletes is A, do you have the passive range of motion to actually get at least hip extension to neutral and preferably past neutral, and B, if you have that range of motion, are you actively able to stabilize it? And one of the things that I've learned over the years from seeing literally thousands of throwers at this point is that you can't assume. So you'll have athletes that have crazy mobility but have very, very poor active control of it. You'll have other athletes that you think are going to be tight as can be, but they actually have great hip extension and good control of it. So we're going to use a couple different examples. Leah's going to go first, and what we're going to do is just a quick Thomas test just to see how her hip flexor length is. So she's going to keep left leg up, and what we're going to do is we're just going to basically block off her pelvis here and see if she can get to full hip extension. You'll notice she's able to get her thigh all the way down to the ground without compensation out here, without having to keep the knee straight. So she was what I would call a passing Thomas test. So we're gonna have her stand up for just a second. Nancy's gonna jump in as well. We would expect to see very, very good hip extension passively, really in any female athlete, particularly those who are really, really hypermobile. So Nancy's gonna do the same thing. As she drops down in, there's no deviation to the side. Again, clean Thomas test, everything's pretty good. Hip extension at least to neutral and probably past it. Jaren's gonna step right up in here. Bigger guy, pretty well muscled. He carries a little bit more. We're also going to give him a little bit of wiggle room on this because he's got a butt. A lot of times if you have a butt, it makes it a little bit harder to show full passive hip range of motion. But for him, we maybe get a little bit of deviation to the side, but for the most part, he's within, I'd say, about a half an inch, and he's got big hamstrings and a butt that kind of block him off. So I would call him a passing Thomas test, even though there is a little bit more, I guess, knee extension in this case. So what we're going to do, though, is we're going to spin around. So I kind of got the cheat sheet ahead of time just to kind of see how people are doing. We're actually going to have Nancy jump back in here, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at her hip extension on her right side. So we'll keep her left leg in close to the table to simulate a little bit of hip separation like you would get with the pitching delivery. What we're going to actually have her to do is take her to about neutral. I don't want her really, really flexed under because that's going to give us kind of a false limitation. And I don't want her really extended because then she's being able to get too much range. And all I want to see is, with Nancy bracing her core nice and tight, how much hip extension can she get on that right side? We'll keep it kind of standardized, so we're going to keep everybody's knees straight as we do this. So go ahead. What you realize is she probably has, I'd say, a -20 to -25 before she starts going to a compensation. What we'll do is let's go ahead and do that and really force it all the way up so they can see. You'll see that she has to get a lot of motion from her low back if she was to come up to a position that really would be required during the pitching delivery. So what I would say for Nancy is that's a limiting factor, right? That's a ton of passive range of motion into hip extension that she can't actively control with good glute recruitment. And your glutes are really going to give you that posterior pull on the head of your femur to alleviate stress in the front. So what we'll do is we'll have Jaren jump back in. For him, this is a guy where maybe you're expecting him to have a little bit more trouble overcoming that stiffness we would expect of a guy who carries more muscle mass. And what's really interesting about him is he extends his hip, keeping that knee straight. He actually has really pretty good hip extension. I'd say he's close to neutral, maybe like a -5. Again, the bigger butt makes it a little bit harder to really differentiate, but we're not seeing really any lumbar extension taking place there. So last one we're going to have is Leah, and Leah is actually a really, really good example. So she's going to come in and demonstrate, and we'll see kind of the dynamic difference between her and Nancy, where they both have lots of passive range of motion, but Leah actually demonstrates the active range of motion. So you'll see she, without compensation, come on up and can get a ton of hip extension to neutral. And what's interesting about Leah is she had an ACL tear a year and change ago, so she's been going through a lot of glute activation of the rep, and you'll see on the opposite side as well. She's able to extend her hip with a little bit of lateral deviation, but even if I straighten her out, she's able to get to full hip extension without the compensation. So what I would say is for Nancy, we need to work a lot on improving active range of motion, but I don't think in any of the three of these are we doing a ton of aggressive hip flexor stretching. All of them showed us that they could get that full hip extension. We want to make sure that if we're going to increase passive range of motion at the hip, we want to improve active range of motion instead. So prone hip extension is a good test, but it's also an outstanding exercise you can use to improve that active control. You should be focused on getting good glute activation, not feeling the low back, not firing up the hamstrings, and you certainly shouldn't feel any pinching in the front of your hip. So great one if you have anterior hip discomfort after pitching, or if you're someone who's starting to notice a lot of that lower back tightness as well.